This is a real treat for me to be here. I've been so lucky to not only work on this book, but go around the country talking about it, talking about David Fairchild. And there are a few places of history, places of legacy that really help this story come alive. In the Philosophical Society, where Fairchild was not a member, but his family was. His father-in-law, Alexander Graham Bell, was a member here. So it's special for me to be here. I also used to come to Independence Hall as a kid. My grandparents lived in Wynwood, so I'm well acquainted with Philadelphia and feel very lucky to be here with you all tonight. I want to tell you a story about this man and really a story about our country. And I always like to start with this map. This is a map that we ran in National Geographic magazine about 3 years ago, along with an article about food origins, right? It's not meant to be comprehensive of everything, right? But it's meant to show you where things come from. Things that we think of as American are not really American in origin, right? The apples in apple pie from Kazakhstan, right? All of our oranges and our lemons and limes, all citrus, comes from southern and eastern China. Bananas are actually the single most sold item at Walmart, but bananas are native to Papua New Guinea, where there are still hundreds of varieties of bananas you can try. Many of us know coffee from Ethiopia, pineapples from the north coast of South America, avocados from Mexico, Central America. What's meant to jump out at you on this map is that aside from the sunflower, which we sort of put just so the continent wouldn't look so bare, is that not much comes from North America. Some varieties of tomatoes, some cranberries, early varieties of corn, but most things that we acquaint with our supermarkets are not here. They came here the way many of our families did, as immigrants. I want to tell you about Fairchild because this was sort of the reality that Fairchild was born into. Fairchild grew up in Kansas, surrounded by farmers. More than half of the labor force in the 1870s when he was born were farmers. And they didn't have a lot of crop diversity. Many of them grew the same few crops. Corn, oats, barley, wheat. They raised livestock, and not much diversity, not much flourish in terms of flavor. I usually hate to put text on screen, and I only do it twice, so I apologize. I will read you this. This is an editorial that ran in a journal called The Progressive Farmer. It spoke for farmers in 1887. And you could sense the frustration that farmers felt from that lack of crop diversity. There is a screw loose. The wheels have dropped out of balance. The railroads have never been so prosperous, and yet agriculture languishes. The banks have never done a better or more profitable business, and yet agriculture languishes. Manufacturing enterprises never made more money or were in a more flourishing condition, and yet agriculture languishes. Towns and cities flourish and boom and grow and boom, and yet agriculture languishes. Salaries and fees were never so temptingly high and desirable, and yet agriculture languishes, right? Just beating that drum of frustration. Everyone's making money, the banks, the railroads are doing well, but to be a farmer, to all be growing the same thing, floods the market, drops the prices, and everyone ends up worse off the harder they work, right? This is a bit more colorful language from an activist named Mary Elizabeth Lease about 3 years after that, 1890. What farmers need to do is raise less corn and more hell. The parties lie to us, and the political speakers mislead us. We were told to go to work and raise a big crop. That was all we needed. We went to work and plowed and planted. The rains came, the sun shone, nature smiled, and we raised the big crop that they told us to. And what came of it? 8-cent corn, 10-cent oats, 2-cent beef, and no price at all for butter and eggs. That's what came of it. Right? That real visceral anguish that farming is not a profitable business. Farming is the engine of the American economy, and it's really not moving anyone very far. This was the world Fairchild was a boy during. He grew up in Kansas, as I mentioned. He was also fairly lucky from childhood. And he grew up in the small town of Manhattan, Kansas. They call it the Little Apple. And Fairchild's father was the president of Kansas State Agricultural University. And as a result of being the president, they were lucky to have a running stream of visitors who would stay in their house, right? So many of you could tell that the man on the left side of the screen here, this is Charles Darwin, right? The father of natural selection, the theory of evolution, right? And on the right here is Alfred Russel Wallace, who is also one of the co-fathers of natural selection and the theory of evolution. Darwin was working on his theory in the Galapagos, while Wallace was working on his theory in the Malay archipelago of Malaysia and Indonesia on the other side of the world. And it was Wallace who came to visit the Fairchilds in Kansas in the 1880s and inspired young Fairchild with stories about the other side of the planet. And I always like to say that this seems just like a happenstance meeting, but this was sort of like meeting someone who had walked on the moon, right? Someone who had been somewhere that you had never even heard of or thought about or met anyone who had been even close to. And suddenly here's a world traveler in your living room inspiring a young man that he too could travel and see remarkable things anywhere on Earth. Right, Fairchild finds his way to Washington, D.C., and he gets a job as a junior scientist at the USDA. And on the left here is his official portrait for the government, and on the right is his action shot, right? Most of the work of the USDA in that era, in the 1880s and 90s, was really defense, right? Figuring out what was the problem with a crop, right? A disease had taken over. A blight, a fungus, a bacteria infection, how can we eradicate it, right? It wasn't really proactive, it was reactive. And so most of the work was filling up this tank on his back with who knows what, couldn't have been good, right? And spraying it on plants to hope to inoculate them or to make them healthy in a way. And Fairchild saw that this work was necessary, but not really solving any major problems and certainly not finding solutions. And so he found a way to travel for the first time. And he took a steamship, this is actually the ship he took, across the ocean for an internship at the Smithsonian in Italy. Right? Now, to be a young man of his early 20s and to take a steamship, again, is sort of like taking a rocket ship, right? This is an opportunity no one in his family has ever had to travel abroad, to take a steamship where he could sit around a dining table with the finest people and use the finest china that he's ever seen. And it's really on this boat that he has another stroke of luck. And it's the sort of luck that happens, I think, many times to many of us in our lives. And if you're not paying attention, it just goes, right? Gone. But he was paying attention this time. He told someone on board that one day he wanted to go to Java. He wanted to go to the Malay archipelago that Wallace had inspired him about. And he finds out that on this boat is a man who has been to the Malay archipelago also, and who has also traveled around the world about 12 times. And he's been everywhere. This is Barbara Lathrop. This was one of the passengers on that ship. He was a fabulously wealthy, globe-trotting, millionaire, playboy bachelor, right? You can imagine the type of person who finances his travels on his millions and just constantly roaming around the world on these steamships, staying at the finest hotels, eating the finest meals, and staying in motion. And he and Fairchild kind of take a liking to each other. Fairchild is a young man of science and curiosity and extremely naive, right? He's never been anywhere. He's never really talked to anyone in a formal way. And Barbara Lathrop has been everywhere, right? And he has the money and the means and the know-how to be a real gentleman of his era. And they decide that they kind of form a decent team. Fairchild has his scientific backing and Lathrop has the money, and that together they might do some exploring and they might do some scientific work for the U.S. government to help farmers like the ones Fairchild grew up around. Now, their association together was pretty awkward from the start, just growing pains. You could imagine that, a man who is a refined man of the world meeting a young man from the plains of Kansas who's never really been anywhere. They didn't really hit it off, personality-wise at first. You could tell in this photo on the left is Lathrop, right, looking straight at the camera, very confident. His mustache is very plump, right? And on the left is Fairchild looking to the side. He's a little unsure. He's not sure what he's doing or where he is. And this was taken on a steamer off the coast of Sumatra, which was one of the first places they went together because Lathrop had financed their travels. Early in their relationship, Lathrop had also given the sort of lightning bolt of good fortune to Fairchild, and he said, I want to invest in you. I want to invest in the future work that you'll do on behalf of your country and humanity. And I want to give you $1,000 to finance your interests and your passions. This is 1894, right? $1,000 is about $25,000, $30,000 today, right? Not a small amount of money just to kind of wish on someone and say, do what you will. But that was sort of the nature of their relationship. Lathrop, more money than God, and Fairchild, more ambition than anyone else he knew. They had a series of adventures together. This is one of the first, and I want to tell you just a couple brief anecdotes about what Fairchild did once he had that money and that push. And this is the first one that he does on his own. He gets a telegram from Washington while he's living in Italy that says, we need you to go to Corsica. Corsica, the small island in the middle of the Mediterranean, is known for growing the best citron in the world, right? Citron is an ancestral variety of citrus. Any lemon or most oranges come from citron descendants, right? And so Corsicans grow some of the best citron that exists, and they say, we need you to go to Corsica to acquire some of this citrus breed stock so that growers in California can enhance their crops with better genes. Fairchild's very excited. This is an assignment from his government, right? So he goes to Corsica. He gets to the port. He rents a mule, and he rides the mule to the top of this mountain in the middle of the island, and he's poking around and trying to blend in, right? He's got his big Kodak camera with the big curtain, with his big tripod, so he kind of stands out, and he's taking photos of everything, including this photo that he takes of these women in the street next to these houses. It's a fairly unremarkable photo, but immediately after he takes this photo, he's arrested, right? He is suspected of being an outsider, which he is. He is suspected of being a spy, which he technically is, right? He's an agricultural spy. A policeman takes him and incarcerates him and says, what are you here for? What do you want? And it's all in French. And Fairchild can't speak French, right? He's sort of a bumbling idiot. He can't say anything. He can't make himself understood. And they suspect him of being a military spy, of wanting to take over the island or learn about it so that it can maybe make a play for these people and this land that is so dear to them. And Fairchild makes it understood that he has no idea what's going on. And so they let him go. And he takes his mule down the mountain, and on the way down, he sees he's not being pursued, and so he darts into a field of citron. And he takes 3 cuttings, and he takes 3 fruit, and he rides to the bottom of the mountain, and he sticks those cuttings into potatoes so that they'll be nourished on the long ship ride back to Washington. And that's the first time he really has success. He gets the job done, right? It scared the daylights out of him to be arrested and maybe spend the rest of his life in this dirty prison, but he got the job done, and that's all anyone in Washington really cared about. These citron varieties make their way to California as intended. They are infused into California citrus growers' hands and infused into their crops. Where they enhance citrus in the days before the orange groves of Southern and Central California. This on the right here is a watercolor portrait that was commissioned by the US government. The government commissioned a whole series of watercolor paintings of all the fruits coming in from Fairchild and other people doing this work in a day before photography could really capture the color and vibrance and nuance of something like the citron. Citron, by the way, is also known as an etrog in the Jewish tradition during the festival of Sukkot. They're very hard to come by now. They're very expensive. They're fairly rare. But this is the Corsican citron that Fairchild picked up that day in Corsica. Many of us have seen this fruit, right? It's pretty popular right now. Fairchild had traveled through the Caribbean and across the mountains of Panama, down the coast of South America near Peru and Ecuador and Chile. And it was in Chile that he comes across a superior avocado, a better one than he had ever seen. Right? He had seen avocados before, but they were bad. They had really stringy flesh, right? The stone was really big, most of the fruit. The skin was really thin. It bruised really easily. And there were no great avocados. And so Fairchild comes across a better one outside of Santiago. And this avocado has a smaller stone, which I know doesn't look like it in this painting, but it's much smaller than they were. The flesh is creamier, right? It grows a lot faster, and its skin is a lot thicker. And he thinks this is a superior avocado that will grow very well and very reliably in Southern California. Similar climate to Santiago. So he sends about 1,000 avocado seeds on a boat back to Washington, where they arrive fairly moldy, as you'd imagine, as what happens in many of our refrigerators from time to time, but they were still alive, right? And they were propagated in Washington and sent out to growers in California as Fairchild intended. Now, some of those growers were scientists, some of them were chefs, and some of them were just amateurs like me, right? A guy with a garden who likes to grow things and hopefully it works. And one of those people who was just an enthusiast, an avocado enthusiast, was a letter carrier. He was a postal worker for the US government, and in his spare time grew avocados. And he grew avocados that were descendants from Fairchild's introduction, and he grew them for decades. And about 2 decades after Fairchild introduces his avocado from Chile, this man decides, a friend of his suggested that he patent his avocado, right? Why? Because it grew faster, it fruited even sooner in the season, its skin was the thickest he had ever seen, its stone had gotten the smallest anyone had ever seen, and it was a verifiable, superior avocado. And that man, the letter carrier, patented it. His name was Rudolf Haas, and this is the patent of the first Haas avocado in 1935. And you could see his name here on the bottom, the Haas. It's a fairly simple drawing, but I love it because it still captures it, right? There's not much more to an avocado than you could see in this drawing of how they grow. Fairchild always referred to avocados as alligator pears, which I think is such a delightful and illustrious way to describe them. Fairchild went to more than 50 countries, 52 countries, all of them by boat. And one of the hardest to get to was to get to Baghdad, right? Baghdad was the heart of civilization. It was one of the origins of agriculture, right? The Fertile Crescent. And Fairchild had, at this point, developed a system, unlike in Corsica, where he would get in and out and hope not to get arrested. He became more of a diplomat, right? He would go to markets, and he would talk to growers, and he would learn about what they grew and what they suggested and how much water something needed and soil and sun. And then he would ask them for some of their crop, right? Here's a market that he went to. These growers were selling grains. They would cover their piles with carpets to keep out the birds and to prevent their piles from diminishing. And Fairchild talked to these growers and took their photos, maybe the first photos of these men that had ever been taken, and really got to know them and stayed in touch with them after. But it was in Baghdad that Fairchild picked up a crop that would also transform a different part of Southern California, right? Dates. Dates are native to the Middle East, of course. They grow best in really warm, really arid climates. And anyone who's ever been to Palm Springs or Coachella, right, knows that that climate is very similar to the Middle East. Really warm desert, really, really hot summers, cool nights. This is the Deglet Noor date that Fairchild picked up. Actually, here's his name on this portrait painting. And Fairchild introduces dates. He picks up more than 32 varieties of date suckers, these small date plants that he wraps in mud, and then another layer of mud, and repeatedly, so the outer layers would dry and the inside would stay wet and moist for a month or two on their way back to the U.S. This crop transformed a region and transformed the economy of Western California, close to the Arizona border. And anyone I said who's ever been in that region knows that dates are now part of the culture. You can get them at any roadside stand, they're in every supermarket, and they grow very well there. This is a photo from a town this is a date sucker in this town called Mecca, California, that was named Mecca in the teens, about a decade and a half after Fairchild's introduction. Named Mecca out of genuine appreciation for the region of the world that had transformed their soil and their economy. Right? I always like to joke that Mecca isn't actually that close to Baghdad, but it was sort of close enough, right? It captured the spirit of where these fruits came from and their economic potential. The city of Mecca, California, I think in the early 20s, they renamed the mascot of the high school the Arab, right? Which is remarkable, right, for the 1920s. But it was, again, in sort of a genuine sign of respect and appreciation for this region and these people who had so generously transformed this part of California. This is Fairchild took about 14,000 photos, and this, I think, is my favorite. This is a portrait of a grower in Germany, right? Fairchild is sent to Germany to acquire the best hops in the world. Better hops to brew better beer. And German growers knew that they had the best beer in the world. They actually hired young men to guard their fields at night so their hops wouldn't disappear or be diluted within their genetics. And so Fairchild goes and probably could have done what he did in Corsica, right? Wait till 3, 4 in the morning till the young men fall asleep, take a few cuttings, leave town. But again, he had developed sort of a style of diplomacy at this point. He wanted botanical friendship and really strong relations of respect. And so he decided to flatter the growers. He befriended them. He sat with them in the beer hall at night, the way, the German men would all come together. He bought a plaque for one of the growers' houses that commemorated this is the site of the greatest hops in the world, right? He laid it on pretty thick. And he took this man's portrait, which was, again, a rare honor, a real pleasure, right? Fed the ego in a way that really nothing could in 1901 when he was in Bavaria. And it worked. One of the growers, perhaps this man, knocked on Fairchild's door one night and said, "I think I know what you're after. You can't tell anyone, but go to the next town and I will send you a shipment of hops. You should receive them, and then you should leave." Yeah. And Fairchild did exactly that. He received the hops. He sent a large shipment of them back to Washington. They were propagated. They were sent to growers in the Midwest, northern Midwest, and eventually out into the Pacific Northwest, which is maybe the best hops growing region in the world. And it was fortuitous for a few reasons. One, it helped transform America's beer brewing industry to have better genetic breed stock of hops. This was the era when the Budweisers and Millers were first really growing and producing the best beer that they could. But it was also fortunate because about 2 decades after Fairchild takes this photo, a lot of the German hops fields were destroyed by bombs in World War I and World War II. Some of those same hop varieties were growing then in US soil and could be saved, and were eventually sent and reshared with the Bavarian government, the German government, after both wars. Unfortunately, a lot of the American hops fields were also dug up during Prohibition, but enough of them were salvaged in a way that Germans still now believe they have the best beer in the world, and I think we can be pretty proud of our beer too, right? So both countries tend to win with this crop that was a symbol of division and then unity and friendship as a result of Fairchild's work. One of the kind of the most adored stories of Fairchild, and the one you'll recognize, is during his visit to Yokohama that same year in Japan, just south of Tokyo. And Fairchild spends almost a whole summer in Japan learning about agriculture from gardeners and learning about crops that grow really well in Japan. That's where he acquires wasabi, which he introduces for the first time to the US. And this is the front page of the catalog of the Yokohama Nursery Company in that year, 1901. And this crop that he sees is a crop that he sees all over Japan that's blooming almost all summer that he's there. This is known as the Sakura tree, right? The cherry blossom is how we know it. And to Fairchild, you got to understand, these are beautiful, beautiful trees, but these are mostly worthless trees, right? There's no fruit, there's no crop, nothing you can really sell other than the tree itself, I guess. But there's no kind of commercial or economic incentive behind it. So he doesn't introduce it. He sort of marvels and he leaves. But it was about, maybe about 5 to 10 years later when he arrives back home in Washington. He and his wife, he had then gotten married, they buy a house in Maryland, in Chevy Chase. And for decorating their property, they order a series of Sakura trees for their own land just outside of the capital. People start to notice these trees. They're beautiful trees. They bloom every spring. And people start coming up from downtown Washington, including President William Taft and his wife, a series of cabinet secretaries and government officials who start noticing that these are beautiful trees and that perhaps these trees could be used to beautify America's capital. And so Fairchild is tasked with negotiating this exchange, this gift that he writes to the Japanese government in hopes that they'll send a few thousand trees to plant around the Washington Monument, right? A beautiful place that's not really that beautiful then because the river kind of laps up. It's very muddy. There's nothing beautiful about it. And so Fairchild negotiates this gift, which the Japanese are very eager to give because this is a symbol of their culture that's going to be planted in the rising superpower of the world, right? This is a growing country in power and influence. And so the trees arrive in Washington. These are the propagation greenhouses on the National Mall. And these trees arrive and they are inspected, right? They're inspected to not bring in any pests. But in the Japanese government's and the Japanese gardeners' enthusiasm and eagerness to send these trees, they sent pretty mature trees, and you could see them kind of down here on the left. Trees with long roots so that they would mature faster and bloom within a year. And because these roots were so long, they came with a lot of soil packed around them. And when they were inspected, those roots were found to have 6 varieties of scale insects, 4 varieties of fungus, and certainly bacteria and uncountable numbers of whatever was in Japanese soil that might not do well in American soil. Now, Fairchild tried to salvage this. He thought, this could be a problem, but I will take care of it. And he volunteered to comb the roots of all of the trees. I will make sure that nothing will get through. And the entomologists, right, the insect scientists of the USDA said, that's not good enough. This is biological. This could be a major risk, and we can't afford this risk. And they prevailed on the president, who ordered that the trees be burned, right? So all of those 2,000 trees were put up in these bonfires and set afire. And it was done very publicly, right? It was kind of in a in a sloppy way. This was a photo taken by a reporter for the New York Times. The burning of the trees was featured on the front page of the New York Times the next day. It was a very public rebuke to this gift that had been given and so delicately arranged. And Fairchild, feeling awful about the whole thing, goes to the Japanese ambassador's hotel room and really wants to apologize and says, "We are so sorry that this happened, that this was such an embarrassment for both of our countries." And to everyone's surprise, the Japanese ambassador said, "No, we are sorry. We sent you a faulty and a dirty gift. Of course you had to burn them. You couldn't take that risk. Who knows what would have happened?" And so because of that friendship, because of that understanding between them, the Japanese government agreed to send a second shipment of trees. This time about 3,000 trees grown in what gardeners call virgin soil, right? They were sent over on an express steamer and shipped on an express rail car directly to Washington, where they were inspected, cleared inspection, and were planted around the Washington Monument and the Tidal Basin. This is a photo from the late 1950s, and you could see how these trees have bloomed and matured almost to the point where we all recognize them today. Many of you have been to the Cherry Blossom Festival. It looks like this, and is for about maybe 4 to 5 days. It's stunning. It is wall-to-wall people, but it is stunning. What's interesting about these trees is that they last about 25 to maybe 35 years, their lifespan. Most of the original trees have died, and they have been replaced by propagation from cuttings from the older trees. But there are still, last I heard about last year, there are 4 of the original trees that still exist at different parts around the Tidal Basin. And if you walk around, you can spot them very easily because they're very big and rotund and these kind of big pieces of bark, and they look like trees that have been there for 110 years. Yeah. It's kind of a fun scavenger hunt to try to go find them. But they were planted in a private ceremony with the president and the first lady, a few gardeners, a female reporter named Eliza Sidmore, who had been working on getting cherry trees there for a long time, and David Fairchild, who finally was able to get it done. These are photos of the National Arboretum, and we all focus on kind of the big food introductions that Fairchild made. But also, while he was doing much of this work, he was working on the botanical foundation of education for school kids and for people like us, too. People who were interested in gardening, in outdoor spaces, and American research of plants. And so Fairchild was on the committee that not only helped start the U.S. Botanical Garden, but also the U.S. Arboretum. These are early photos from the 1940s when it opened to the public and is still a beautiful place to visit in Washington and part of his legacy. Now, over time, what starts to emerge is a new map, and this is from the book. We had it made. I call it The Fruits of Fairchild. And again, it's not comprehensive. He brought in thousands of different things, but these are some of his greatest hits, right? Avocados here on the bottom left, types of watermelons too, citron in Corsica, along with hops in Bavaria. He picked up seedless grapes just outside of Venice, Italy, and pomegranates out of Malta. He picked up a long fiber variety of cotton in Egypt, which he introduced to Arizona, which became known as Egyptian cotton, right? Some of the finest cotton and synonymous with luxury. Dates in Baghdad, certainly nectarines and peaches in southern and western Asia. Papayas in Ceylon, as Sri Lanka, as it was known. Cherry blossoms in Japan, and more than 50 varieties of mangoes from India all the way over to the Philippines. He loved mangoes, and he was always eager to find better and better mangoes, and always lamented that in the U.S. we didn't have more tropical land that could grow tropical fruit. Right, now on this map, there's one that always sticks out to me, and that certainly stuck out to him. His favorite fruit, his favorite introduction of his entire life and his entire career is right here on the bottom right? This kind of purple fruit known as a mangosteen, right? It's the one with kind of these white wedges here, right here. Mangosteen. He called it the queen of fruits. Has anyone here ever tried a mangosteen? A couple hands, yeah. It's very difficult to get here or anywhere really in the U.S. It grows native in Southeast Asia. And Fairchild loved it. If you've ever tried it, it's like sort of like eating custard out of this little cup that's, it's delicious. It's not too fibrous, it's not too sweet, it's delightful. And here's a kind of a bigger portrait. This is the mangosteen on the right, again, the Corsican citron on the left. These were kind of his most prized introductions. And he never really could get the mangosteen to catch on. And I've talked tonight a lot about his successes, but this was kind of one of his misses, his failures. And when people wonder, why couldn't this fruit that's so delightful, so delicious, catch on, right? It really tells a story about why we eat the fruits that we do, and of the thousands of fruits in the world, why we don't eat most of them, right? The mangosteen is delicious, but it's got a very thick skin, right? Look how thick that rind is. That's all weight that you have to ship and pay for, that you throw away. It's fruit, very sweet, but it's these white wedges here, but inside is a pit almost in every wedge, so there's a lot of work to eat it, right? It ripens very quickly. You have about 2, maybe 3 days off the tree to eat it, and it bruises very easily too, so you can't really ship it too far. And if you get all those things to line up, by some fortuitous miracle, you get it to a market in Philadelphia, and it costs $15 a pound, right? It just doesn't quite work as a fruit. It has a very thin, weak resume. So when you compare it to like an apple or a banana or citrus that ships well, that grows easily, that grows reliably, that can be cloned and propagated at great volume, can sit in a supermarket for many days and sit in your kitchen for even longer, that's sort of what makes a fruit like a super fruit. I call it the 1% of fruits, right, in our markets. The mangosteen just didn't have it. And also on this map, in the bottom center here, Fairchild loved the dwarf pineapple. He thought it was delightful, right here in the, this pineapple that was personal sized, right? Who wouldn't want a pineapple just for themselves, the way you'd eat an apple, right? Just one serving. And the growers in the U.S. and certainly in Hawaii in those days said, we don't want small pineapples. The money's in big pineapples, bigger, bigger, bigger. And so the dwarf pineapple kind of languished and never really caught on. But food changes, markets change, economies change, and the dwarf pineapple changed. And you can imagine my surprise. This was about 4 months ago. This was in Whole Foods near my house. I walked by it. I did like a triple take. And yeah, these are mangoes here on the right. You could see for scale, right, how small they are. Personal size pineapples. $5, right? Like not cheap. But for the novelty at Whole Foods, right, maybe they sold them all, and maybe they get that price point down enough that it can be shipped further distances, and many of us could try them as a general part of our grocery shopping. Now, I want to end tonight with a story of some tension, right? I'm talking about a lot of success that Fairchild had, a lot of fun adventures, but he also had some opposition, and it wasn't always rosy for him. This was a friend of his on the right side. This was a man named Charles Marantt. The two of them grew up together. They're about the same age, even though they don't look like in this photo. Marantt grew up in Kansas with Fairchild, and they took a very similar path to Washington to work for the USDA. And Fairchild becomes a botanist, and Marantt becomes an entomologist, right? He's one of the insect scientists behind the cherry blossom episode. And while Fairchild is talking about kind of the wondrous bounty that exists in the world to bring back, that America can use to grow its taste and grow its economy, Marantt's fearful of the risks, the biological risks many of these things pose. And the two of them have this debate over what is the value and is there more risk than it's worth to have these things come into our country? And Fairchild says yes, and Marantt says no, and they take this debate very public. These are dueling magazine covers on National Geographic from the same year that the two of them wrote. And you could see Fairchild's cover is on the left here. His cover story is called New Plant Immigrants, right? Very rosy, optimistic. These plants are our friends. They're our family, right? They're our immigrants. Let's welcome them. And Marantt's here on the right is called Pests and Parasites, right? They're arguing about very similar plants, like, very similar crops and episodes, things that were helpful and things that might have been collateral baggage that came in with these plants that posed biological risk, certain blights to chestnut trees, to peach trees, to different types of vines that overtook native varieties. And the two of them sort of debate this very publicly, but Marantt eventually prevails. Right, he wins, and he takes advantage of a larger spirit of nativism, of isolationism that's coming to the U.S. around World War I, of being wary of outside ideas and plants and even people in this era where America had grown a little too quickly, too fast, and suddenly had to turn inward. And so Marantt convinces Congress to pass a quarantine law. A quarantine stipulating that plants cannot just come in willy-nilly. They have to come in at only a few different ports. They have to be inspected thoroughly. They have to be grown in new soil from virgin seed. And they have to be inspected thoroughly before they can be sent out to experiment stations. And those are a lot of speed bumps, right? It doesn't stop Fairchild's work, but it puts up roadblocks that prevent the volume that he was working with. That quarantine law, incidentally, is also the reason this was passed in 1912 and was amended later, but that law is still the reason why today, when all of us get on an airplane from a foreign country, you fill out that little form that says, I haven't been on a farm, or I'm not bringing in fruit. I like to end with the story of this man. Fairchild, as the result of these speed bumps and the quarantine, but also having gotten married and having a few kids, Fairchild couldn't travel as freely, as vigorously as he had, just go around the world with Barbara Lathrop or on his own. And so he hires a group of 3 young men to continue this work, to continue food hunting and plant exploration. Now, one of those young men goes to Guatemala to find better avocados. One goes to Russia to find better wheat. And the third is this man, Frank Meyer, whose job is to walk across China, right? Walk across China in search of novel plants that no Westerner has ever seen. This is a country that's been farming for thousands of years and has presumably some of the best crops and the best agricultural methods on earth. And Frank Meyer is sort of the best man for the job. He is an immigrant from Holland who comes to Washington. He loves to be alone, he loves plants, and he loves to walk, right? Perfect resume for this job, right? He gets the job, and Fairchild sends him off. And Frank Meyer spends more than a decade quite literally walking around and through China in search of novel crops and meeting people and having harrowing adventures, right? He's regularly beat up, he's robbed, he's attacked by wild animals, and he lives to tell about all of it. And he brings back thousands of varieties of new things and old crops as well that he had picked up. He even brought back a pair of monkeys at one point for the National Zoo. And Meyer's, he picked up varieties of wild persimmons and pears and oats and certainly citrus varieties that can be traced to him. But his most famous is the only one that was ever named after him. And Meyer sees this fruit in a family's doorway. It's a citrus fruit that hangs off a tree. It is bright yellow, like an egg yolk. That's how he describes it. And he tastes it, and its skin is really thin, and its flesh is very juicy, and it's sweeter than a lemon and more tart than an orange. It turns out to be a natural hybrid of the two. And he introduces it to California, where it's grown in some of the citrus fields north of Sacramento, and eventually it finds its way into many other fields in Florida and Texas and onto menus around the world. This is what we now know as the Meyer Lemon. And it is not only a great lemon for lemonade, because it's sweet and not too tart, but it's also a favorite of people who really like to cook. Celebrity chefs like Martha Stewart and Alice Waters and Alton Brown all have recipes using the Meyer Lemon. And he was very modest, right? I said he liked to be alone. He never really liked to take much credit. But Meyer knew that with this introduction and many of his others, that this would be remembered, that he would be remembered. And one of my favorite quotes of Meyer's in his hundreds of letters that he had written adventures included the line, he said, "I will be famous someday. Just wait a century or two." Yeah. Thanks very much for having me here. I'm happy to take questions.
That was a great talk, Dan. Thank you. And he said he will take some.
Happy to take questions, yeah.
So I get the prerogative of the first question.
Please.
You know, I read the book when it first came out. Would you tell a little bit about his private life and the fact that he did have a romance with sort of a prominent family and really had quite a happy personal home life?
Yeah, Fairchild traveled with Barbara Lathrop for more than a decade, and he gets back to Washington when he's 36, right? He's pretty old for a bachelor in those days. And he is invited to speak at National Geographic, and in the audience is Alexander Graham Bell, one of the founding editors of National Geographic. And Bell realizes that here is a young man of science, of adventure, of ambition, and he wants to set him up with his daughter. And he arranges them to meet, and he arranges, kind of a date for them to have, and it works. And Fairchild and Marion Bell end up getting married in Washington. They end up having 3 kids. And I'm jumping ahead, but they really have this courtship that's remarkable and very well documented. And I went up to Nova Scotia, where Alexander Graham Bell had his kind of summer estate. And as a result, his whole family had their summer estate, right? They'd go every summer, so Fairchild would spend their summers up there. And Fairchild's grandchildren still live there, so they're Bell's great-grandchildren. And one day I was up there and I said, "Do you have any personal letters? Do you have any personal archives to kind of give me a portrait of who this man was outside of being a scientist?" And they said, "Well, there's a file of letters in the attic, and have you seen that lately?" "No, I haven't seen it." So we go up and we see the file, and it's got personal in big red letters on the side, and I'm salivating, right? And they said, "Oh, we don't think it would be appropriate to share these. These are private letters. These are grandparents." And I'm thinking, oh man. And I said, "Listen, I totally understand. I have family too. I have grandparents. I worry about legacy. I think about it as a historian. These are letters your family kept for over 100 years, right? In hopes that one day someone might find them interesting. And I'm asking you to trust me and respect me, but I'm here, I'm the person, and please trust me and my intentions." But and they did, and I stayed up all night reading these remarkable letters. There's a whole chapter in the book of you could sort of document their courtship in these little notes that they would deliver to each other's houses for about 2 to 3 months before they got married. Yeah.
I really think that we have to start with this gentleman here who's my friend, and he also is the produce manager from the Acme.
That's great.
You did notice that I said that also the Acme, not the Walmart.
Yeah, there you go.
No, but in actuality, I was thinking about the pomegranates. On your map, you mentioned Malta, expressed Malta, but I always thought it was a Middle Eastern origin, possibly that. Also, why the demise of the citron? Because years ago, when I first started in my industry, dried citron was a staple for fruit cakes. everybody came in and got their, different things for their fruitcakes, and dried citron was number one. Now you don't see any of it, and I don't think in the last 30 years have I seen a citron.
Generally, citrons are harder to grow. They grow slower. They require more water, but a commercial crop, they're not as competitive as a conventional Valencia lemon. That's the short answer. There are also shipping issues. There's where these things grow better. And the parts of California and Texas that grow citrus very well prefer the easier crops. That's the short answer. With pomegranates, as you mentioned, and I'll just go back to this map here. These are not where they're native to, like the first map. These are where he picked them up. And what's interesting is, you can see most of the crops here are on the eastern hemisphere. And because that whole landmass is connected, all these crops really crisscrossed areas and civilizations for centuries before. So even though the pomegranate started in the Middle East, you're right, it was not long before it got to parts of Europe and Africa. It just spread across the land. There you go. But what's interesting here is, almost none of these crops had made it to the Western Hemisphere until about Columbus, right? 500, 600 years ago. And so while the East kind of had this rapid flow of exchange, the West had almost nothing except what it had native, right? Avocados, corn, potatoes, certain varieties of watermelons also. So, but yeah, that's where he picked them up. Annie, should I pick people, or do you want to?
Just why don't you?
Jess? Okay, please.
That way if they get mad, they'll go after her.
There we go.
Thank you for your presentation.
Sure.
I thought it was fascinating.
Thanks.
What did surprise me, however, was a sense. Okay. Is that better? There it is. What did surprise me is that there was a sense that Fairchild and others like him, if there were others like him, were actually thieves, and they were orchestrated by the U.S. government to go out and steal whatever they could. Is that an accurate representation of what he did? Was he doing illegal things, or there weren't laws then? You made it pretty clear about Germany, but in general, was this kind of like a just an illegal activity?
It's a great question, and no is the short answer, because there were no laws about this, right? There was no international understanding about the role of plant exchange. So he was going places, and in his early career, taking, stealing, and maybe not with the express permission. He didn't really feel comfortable doing that, certainly as he got older. Actually, when I described him as a spy to his family, his grandchildren, they took great exception to that term. Because they said, no, he was a botanical diplomat. There is a whole, right? Yeah. There is a whole history before Fairchild of this sort of work, right? The Russians had their man who did this. In Europe, they had people going out and certainly among their colonies and finding valuable plants. And I include the quote at the beginning of the book from Thomas Jefferson, a century before Fairchild lived, who said, "The greatest service which can be rendered any country is to introduce a plant to its culture," right? So that spirit of going places and finding plants was well established. Fairchild certainly did it a lot more, and at the beginning of his career, he did it, kind of in his run-and-gun style. But he realized over time that there were enough of these things and enough people who were willing to share that he didn't need to steal. Yeah. Good question, yeah. Yes, sir.
Change subject a little
Sure.
bit. Did he ever do any investigation of mushrooms? Being in southeastern Pennsylvania, I'm just wondering.
I wish he had. He was a botanist and not a mycologist. And so he has botanical memos from here to the ceiling of every crop that he had ever come across and his detailed observations. But I never found mushrooms, no. Yeah.
Really enjoyed your talk, and I
Thanks.
look forward to reading the book.
Thanks.
How did you find Fairchild? I mean, I've never heard of him before. Obviously, someone did this kind of work, but how did you How did you come upon him, and what made you decide to spend time and write a book about him?
I know I keep saying great question, but that's a great question. I learned about him at National Geographic. He was on the board of the society in the 1920s. He had written about 12 cover stories, including the one I showed you, for the magazine. And he is generally known around there as kind of one of these early figures. However, he's part of this illustrious family of the Bells, and so he had kind of been overshadowed by this scientific legacy of inventors and very wealthy people. And so when people ask me, why haven't we heard of him, right? Why, if he's so influential, if he touches all of our lives every day, why haven't we heard of him? And I have a few theories. I don't know fully, but one, he was a botanist, right? We don't really celebrate botanists in the way we do tech entrepreneurs, right? Very different. Also, he was traveling a lot, so he was always somewhere else and not here. So he wasn't really sitting for newspaper interviews. He wasn't being quoted. He wasn't being profiled. And also, he was a government employee. So he never patented any of his introductions. He never made a lot of money. He was never rich. And he was doing this work on behalf of the USDA. So it was never really personal for him and really visible. He became very well respected. He wrote a memoir of his own in the 1930s. And his name is certainly now known among botanists as kind of the father of plant introduction. But among the general public, yeah, I don't think he really sought that attention nor was really given it. Yeah.
One more.
I see the grapes up there.
Yeah.
You didn't touch how did the grapes come to the U.S. and now, of course, the big wine industry?
Well, yeah, there's a whole history of grapes. You could write a whole book about grapes and where they came from. Grapes are native to the Caucasus, like around Georgia and Azerbaijan. First place they grew grapes and made wine. Fairchild picked up his grapes in a small city called Padua, I think? Padua, thank you, just outside of Venice. And he's meeting with a gardener in Venice who has a very, very small garden, who says, you need to go to this monastery in the next town in Padua and pick up and meet this monk, and this monk will give you grapes. And that exactly happened. Fairchild goes, he takes a day trip, and he gets these grapes and sends not only the rootstock, but also some fruit back. These are not the first grapes to ever be in North America, but they were seedless, and that made them valuable. Yeah.
Won't you join me, please, in thanking Dan?
Thank you.